William Blake's poem London essentially represents the anger and despair of a passionate and righteous poet at the existence of poverty, as well as the attitudes of the wealthy to it, in the British capital. Many readers who have perhaps witnessed poverty on the streets of their town or city will recognise and relate to the dark and despairing emotions that Blake expresses in the poem, which presents itself as a diatribe, or bitter attack, against inequality. London was published in the Georgian era, in the year 1794, by British Romantic poet William Blake, who, despite being relatively unknown in his day, has since become one of the most renowned poets of his era. Blake's poetry often explored themes such as the innocence and corruption of humankind, the power and cruelty of religion, and the beauty and wonder of nature. Blake's two most famous collections of poetry, which are often published together, are Songs of Innocence, which explores moral lessons and ideas of childhood, and Songs of Experience, which explores darker aspects of life, such as poverty and the cruelty of humanity. This video is a short explanation of some of the key ideas and themes of the poem London. If you want to catch my illustrated reading of the poem, click the link at the end or visit my channel Comics and Lit. The poem London is part of Blake's Songs of Experience collection, and as such has a grim and world-weary message. Its two key themes, the desperation of poverty and the cruelty and ignorance of those in power, perhaps are as relevant in today's society as they were in Blake's time. London is an overtly political poem. Blake wrote it as a damning criticism of the inequality he witnessed in his society. And if you followed recent inequality protest movements, such as Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, or Save Our NHS, you'll have a pretty good idea of how Blake was feeling when he wrote London. Furious, indignant, and despairing. The content of the poem basically consists of a narrator, whom we might assume is Blake himself, walking through the streets of Georgian London and describing the pain and suffering that appears everywhere he looks. It is written in the first person, which uses the pronoun I to create the feeling of being in the narrator's head. We see what they see, and hear what they hear. The opening line, "I wander through each chartered street," begins the journey into the dark side of London. Every face the narrator meets he sees marks of weakness, marks of woe. Woe is an abstract noun, which means great sorrow. If you look at this engraving of Dudley Street in London by Gustave Doré from 1872, you can imagine the sort of scenes the narrator is describing. Weak and malnourished children, desperate adults and filthy streets. Blake's use of the first-person narrator creates a closeness to the suffering of the people in the poem. We are forced to look at them as Blake does, and feel the anger and frustration as well. Additionally, the poem relies on sensory language, especially the descriptions of sounds. We don't just see individuals, we hear them as well. The lines in the second stanza, "In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear," create a sense that the narrator is surrounded by the desperate wails of poverty. The cries of the chimney sweep metaphorically blacken the churches, and the soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. To Blake, the cries and the wails of the inhabitants of London symbolically stain the city itself. This vivid use of sound language leaves a lasting impression of suffering on the reader, making us question the cruelty and ignorance of the wealthy landowners and elites who let it happen. The most obvious method Blake uses throughout the poem, however, is repetition. The word chartered, which means owned, is used twice, referring to both the London streets and the River Thames. Every part of the city seems to have been bought and owned by the wealthy. Mark appears 3 times. I mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. 'Tis first used as a verb, meaning to notice, and then as a noun, indicating the signs of weakness and woe. Every is repeated a total of 7 times, which creates a sense of overwhelming relentlessness. Blake is hammering the point home. There is no part of this city which is free of poverty or suffering. It is good to think about repetition, not only in terms of words and phrases, but also in mood. The sense of despair is repeated throughout, as is the sense of suffering and hopelessness. Blake's final words contain a bleak and despairing image of a newborn child whose tears are blasted with the curse of a harlot, which means prostitute. Blake describes the harlot's curse blighting, or spoiling, with plagues, the marriage hearse. This has a symbolic meaning. Marriage symbolically represents new beginnings, and this is contrasted with the funeral hearse, a cart which transports a coffin to a funeral. Here Blake uses an oxymoron, a method where two opposite words or ideas are placed close together in a text. In this case, marriage hearse probably represents the terrible fate awaiting the newborn children of London's impoverished citizens. Blake sees their future as cursed by premature death because of the ignorance and sinfulness of humanity. This leaves us with a lasting sense of injustice. There is no happy ending. To Blake, the ignorance of the poor by the wealthy in the London he lived in was a sign of how far humanity had strayed from innocence. With the last words of the poem, Blake confronts those in society who are ignorant of the needs of the poor and asks them to look upon the pain and suffering their selfishness is sustaining. Even today, the poem leaves a strong impression, a mark of Blake's poetic genius.